On a sweltering July morning in 1943, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stepped off a train in the small town of Como, Mississippi, his wrists bound and his uniform stained with weeks of Pacific salt water. He had commanded a squadron of fighter planes over Guadalcanal, had studied at the Imperial Naval Academy, and had been taught that capture meant eternal shame. As he squinted against the brutal southern sun, surrounded by endless cotton fields and strange singing birds he had never heard before, he prepared himself for the torture and degradation he knew awaited him. He could not have been more wrong about what the next 2 years would bring. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Lieutenant Yamamoto and the 327 other Japanese servicemen who arrived at Camp Como that summer would discover would fundamentally challenge everything they had been told about their enemy, about honor, and about the nature of humanity itself. The train journey from the West Coast had taken 5 days, and every mile had carried Yamamoto further into unfamiliar territory. He had expected concrete cells, starvation rations, perhaps beatings from guards seeking revenge for Pearl Harbor. The propaganda films shown during his training had depicted American captors as barbaric, treating prisoners worse than animals. His fellow prisoners whispered among themselves during the journey, sharing stories they had heard, each more terrifying than the last. Some spoke of medical experiments, others of forced labor until death. Yamamoto said nothing, but his jaw remained clenched, his mind racing through the final prayers his mother had taught him as a child. When the trucks finally stopped and the canvas covers were pulled back, what Yamamoto saw made no sense. Neat rows of wooden barracks stretched across cleared land, painted white and arranged in orderly blocks. Trees had been left standing throughout the compound, providing shade. In the distance he could see what appeared to be a baseball diamond in a prison camp. He blinked hard, certain the heat and exhaustion were causing hallucinations. Captain Robert Henderson, the camp commander, was a former schoolteacher from Tennessee who had requested this assignment specifically because he believed in the Geneva Convention not as a legal obligation but as a moral imperative. He stood waiting as the prisoners were unloaded, his posture relaxed, his sidearm holstered. Through an interpreter, he addressed the assembled men in a voice that carried but did not shout. Then Henderson said, "Gentlemen, you are now prisoners of war of the United States Army. You will be treated according to international law and with the respect due to soldiers who fought for their country. You will not be harmed. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. You will be given opportunities for work, education, and recreation. We expect you to conduct yourselves with dignity, and we will do the same." The interpreter translated, and Yamamoto watched the faces of his fellow prisoners. Confusion, suspicion. Some openly scoffed, certain this was psychological warfare, a trick before the real horrors began. Yamamoto felt his own disbelief settling like a stone in his chest. He had been trained to die rather than surrender. Now he was being promised dignity. The first test came at dinner that evening. The prisoners were led to a mess hall, another wooden structure with screened windows and ceiling fans that rotated lazily overhead. They were handed metal trays and directed through a serving line where camp cooks ladled portions of food. Yamamoto stared at his tray. Rice, properly prepared, vegetables, a piece of chicken, bread, fruit. The portions were not generous by peacetime standards, but they were substantial, far more than he had eaten in the final weeks before his capture, when supply lines had collapsed and his unit had subsisted on half rations. Across the table, Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, a machine gunner from Osaka who had fought on Tarawa, picked up his fork with shaking hands. He was 24 years old and had lost 30 pounds during the fighting and subsequent capture. Now he stared at the food as if it might vanish. Then Tanaka said with a trembling voice, "This cannot be real. This is not possible. Why would they feed us like this?" Yamamoto had no answer. He ate slowly, methodically, watching the American guards who stood at intervals around the mess hall. They were armed, but appeared relaxed, even bored. One of them was reading a newspaper. Another was drinking coffee. None of them looked at the prisoners with hatred or disgust. They looked at them the way guards anywhere might look at any group of men eating dinner. That night, lying on a bunk with actual sheets and a pillow, Yamamoto could not sleep. The barracks were hot despite the open windows, but they were clean and well maintained. There were 40 men per building, with adequate space between bunks. Basic toilets and showers had been installed. Outside he could hear the unfamiliar sounds of Mississippi night, crickets, frogs, and somewhere in the distance, music from the guards' quarters. American music with its strange rhythms and incomprehensible lyrics. Private First Class Hiroshi Nakamura, who had the bunk below Yamamoto, whispered up in the darkness. Nakamura was 19, had been conscripted from his family's farm in Hokkaido, and had spent exactly 47 days in combat before his unit was overrun. Then Nakamura said, "Lieutenant, do you think they are fattening us up for something worse? My brother told me the Americans are clever with their cruelty. Maybe this is part of their plan." Yamamoto considered his response carefully. He was the ranking officer among the prisoners, and they looked to him for guidance, for interpretation of their circumstances, but he had no frame of reference for what they were experiencing. Then Yamamoto said, "I do not know, Nakamura. We must remain alert. But for now we follow orders and maintain our discipline. That is all we can do." The days that followed established a routine that seemed impossible to reconcile with everything they had been taught. The prisoners were awakened at 6 each morning, not by harsh whistles or shouts, but by a simple bell. They were given time to wash, dress, and prepare themselves. Breakfast was served at 7. At 8, those who volunteered for work assignments were transported to various locations around the region. This was perhaps the greatest shock of all. The work was real agricultural labor, picking cotton, harvesting vegetables, maintaining irrigation systems, but it was paid work. The prisoners received 80 cents per day in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen to purchase tobacco, candy, writing materials, and other small luxuries. The work was hard, especially in the Mississippi heat, but it was no harder than what the local farmers themselves endured, and the prisoners were given regular breaks, water, and lunch. Yamamoto volunteered for the work crews, partly to stay physically active, partly to observe and understand. On his 3rd day in the cotton fields, working alongside Corporal Masao Fujita, a former fisherman from Kagoshima, he experienced something that would change his perspective forever. The farm they were working belonged to a man named Thomas Mitchell, a 58-year-old widower who had been farming this land for 40 years. Mitchell spoke no Japanese, and the prisoners spoke virtually no English, but he had a way of communicating through gesture and expression that transcended language. Around mid-morning, as the sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive, Mitchell stopped the work crew and directed them to a large oak tree where he had set up a table with pitchers of cold sweet tea and lemonade. The prisoners approached cautiously, uncertain if this was permitted. Mitchell poured drinks into paper cups and handed them out himself, making sure each man received one. Then he sat down on a tree stump, pulled out his own cup, and drank alongside them. No hierarchy, no separation, just men taking a break from hard work in the heat. Fujita, who was standing next to Yamamoto, spoke barely above a whisper. Then Fujita said, "Lieutenant, I do not understand. He treats us as he treats his own workers. Why?" Yamamoto watched Mitchell studying the man's weathered face, his calloused hands, the easy way he moved among them without fear or hostility, and something shifted in his understanding. This was not strategy. This was not clever psychological manipulation. This was simply how this man believed people should be treated. Through the interpreter who accompanied the work crew, Yamamoto asked Mitchell why he treated them with such consideration. Mitchell took a long drink of his tea, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and thought for a moment before responding. Then Mitchell said, "Well, I figure you boys are a long way from home, just like my son is a long way from his home right now. He's in the army, somewhere in Europe. I don't know where exactly, and I hope that whoever's got him, if he ever gets caught, I hope they're giving him some cold tea when he needs it. That's all. Just the golden rule, I suppose." The interpreter translated, and Yamamoto felt something crack inside his carefully maintained armor, of resentment and anger. Mitchell's son was fighting against the Germans, perhaps against the Italians. Maybe he had even fought in North Africa or Sicily, And yet this man could look at Japanese prisoners and see someone else's sons, someone else's brothers. It was a kind of thinking that had never been presented to Yamamoto in all his military training. As the weeks turned into months, the camp developed its own rhythm and culture. The prisoners formed work crews, study groups, and recreational teams. Captain Henderson had authorized the creation of a small library stocked with books in Japanese that had been secured through the Red Cross. There were classes in English, taught by volunteers from the local community, who came to the camp twice a week. There were art supplies for those who wanted to draw or paint. There was even a garden plot where prisoners could grow vegetables using seeds they requested. Yamamoto found himself drawn to the English classes, initially as a way to better understand their captors, but increasingly because he was genuinely curious. The teacher was a retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Walsh, a 72-year-old woman who had taught in the Como public schools for 50 years. She was patient, kind, and absolutely insisted on being called Miss Eleanor by everyone, guards and prisoners alike. She would arrive each Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, carrying a worn leather satchel filled with books, papers, and often homemade cookies that she distributed to her students. The first time she offered Yamamoto a cookie, he refused, uncertain if accepting it would be appropriate. She simply smiled, placed it on his desk, and moved on. The cookie sat there for the entire 90-minute lesson. After she left, Yamamoto wrapped it carefully in a handkerchief and ate it that evening in his bunk. It was oatmeal with raisins, slightly too sweet for his taste, but made with obvious care. He found himself looking forward to Tuesday. One afternoon in October of 1943, during an English lesson, Miss Eleanor asked her students to write a short paragraph about their families. It was a simple exercise designed to practice past tense verbs and possessive pronouns, but for many of the prisoners, it was the first time they had been invited to think about their families as anything other than sources of shame for their capture. Yamamoto wrote slowly, carefully forming English letters that still felt awkward under his pen. He wrote about his father, who had been a teacher himself, who had loved poetry and had taught Yamamoto to appreciate the changing seasons. He wrote about his mother, who had made miso soup every morning without fail, who had sent him off to the Naval Academy with tears in her eyes and a small omamori charm sewn into the lining of his uniform jacket. He wrote about his younger sister, who wanted to be a doctor, but whose dreams had been interrupted by the war. When Miss Eleanor collected the papers, she read Yamamoto's paragraph with a small, sad smile. After class, she asked him to stay for a moment. Through the interpreter, who was always present, she spoke to him directly. Then Miss Eleanor said, "Lieutenant Yamamoto, you write about your family with such love. They must miss you very much. I want you to know that I pray for all of you, that you'll be able to return to them safely when this terrible war is over. And I pray for my grandson too. He's in the Pacific, you see, Navy pilot. I pray every night that someone somewhere is treating him with kindness if he needs it." The interpreter translated, and Yamamoto felt his throat tighten. Her grandson was a Navy pilot, flying against Japanese forces, perhaps against Yamamoto's own former squadron, and yet she came here week after week, bringing cookies and patience and prayers that encompassed both sides of the conflict. The contradiction was too great. Something had to give, and Yamamoto felt it giving inside himself, felt the rigid certainty of his training beginning to crack and crumble. That night, he gathered a group of officers and senior enlisted men in one of the barracks, 23 men in total, ranging in age from 19 to 42, representing every branch of the Japanese military. They spoke in low voices, aware that their conversation might be monitored, but needing to process what they were experiencing. Sergeant Tanaka, who had been among the most skeptical, spoke first. Then Tanaka said, "I have been here for 4 months now. I have not been struck. I have not been starved. I have not been tortured or humiliated. The Americans follow their own rules even when it costs them money and resources to do so. Why?" Lieutenant Yamamoto considered the question carefully before responding. Then Yamamoto said, "I think we were lied to. About many things. We were told the Americans were soft, decadent, without honor or discipline. But what I see here is a different kind of strength. They can be powerful without being cruel. They can be victorious without being barbaric. This confuses me, but I cannot deny what I witness every day." Corporal Fujita, the former fisherman, added his own observation. Then Fujita said, "The farmer Mitchell, he asked me about fishing yesterday. Somehow, we managed to communicate that I was a fisherman before the war. He told me about fishing in the rivers here, about catfish and bass. He was excited to share this with me, like we were old friends discussing our craft. He did not see a prisoner. He saw a fisherman. Private Nakamura, the youngest among them, had tears in his eyes. Then Nakamura said, 'I wrote to my mother last week.' Captain Henderson approved the letter and said it would be sent through the Red Cross. He did not have to allow this, but he did. And when I thanked him through the interpreter, he said it was the least he could do. The least he could do, as if it was nothing. But to me it is everything." The conversation continued late into the night, and a consensus emerged among them. They had been taught that capture meant the end of honor, that they were dead to their families and country. But here, in this unlikely place, they were being shown a different possibility. They were being treated as human beings who had made choices in impossible circumstances, who deserved basic dignity regardless of which side they had fought for. Winter came to Mississippi, mild by Japanese standards, but cold enough that the prisoners were issued additional blankets and warmer clothing. Christmas approached, and the Americans decorated their quarters with lights and trees and played music that spoke of peace and goodwill. Captain Henderson arranged for a special meal on Christmas Day that included turkey, which few of the prisoners had ever tasted, and sweet potato pie, which reminded some of them of Japanese desserts made with satsumaimo. Miss Eleanor and several other community members organized a gift drive, collecting small items that were distributed to the prisoners: handkerchiefs, pencils, writing paper, chocolate bars, and hand-knitted scarves. Each prisoner received a package, handed out by Henderson himself, who shook each man's hand and wished them well through the interpreter. Yamamoto received a package that contained a scarf in navy blue, clearly handmade, with a small card that read, "From the people of Como, Mississippi, with hopes for peace." He held the scarf in his hands, feeling the weight of wool and effort and intention behind it. Someone had spent hours creating this for an enemy prisoner they would never meet. The generosity of it, the sheer improbability of it, overwhelmed him. That evening, wearing his new scarf against the December chill, Yamamoto walked the perimeter of the camp, which prisoners were allowed to do during designated hours. He looked out past the fence at the rolling Mississippi countryside, at the winter-bare trees and the distant lights of town. Somewhere out there, Miss Eleanor was probably sitting by her fireplace, praying for her grandson. Somewhere, Mitchell was likely reviewing his accounts and planning next season's planting. And somewhere across the Pacific, Yamamoto's own family was enduring hardships he could barely imagine, wondering if he was alive or dead, suffering or safe. The war continued. News filtered into the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts that the Americans did not hide from them. They learned of defeats and retreats, of cities destroyed and territories lost. They learned that the war was not going as they had been told it would go, that the promises of quick victory and American collapse had been propaganda and wishful thinking. The industrial might they were witnessing even in this small corner of Mississippi, the resources casually devoted to treating prisoners well, spoke to a capacity for sustained warfare that dwarfed what their own nation could muster. In the spring of 1944, a new group of prisoners arrived at Camp Como, men captured more recently, who brought with them stories of increasing desperation, of kamikaze tactics and final stands. They arrived expecting the worst and found the same incomprehensible kindness that had greeted Yamamoto months earlier. The veteran prisoners took on the role of mentors, helping the newcomers adjust, explaining the rules and rhythms of the camp, and reassuring them that the treatment was real and consistent. Yamamoto found himself assigned to help orient a young pilot named Lieutenant Ichiro Sato, who had been shot down near Saipan and had spent 2 weeks convinced he would be executed at any moment. Sato was gaunt, traumatized, barely able to make eye contact. Yamamoto recognized himself in this young man, recognized the same rigid certainty and fear. They sat together in the shade of an oak tree, and Yamamoto spoke to him honestly. Then Yamamoto said, "Lieutenant Sato, I know what you are feeling. I felt the same when I arrived, but I need you to open your eyes and truly see where you are. You are safe here. You will be treated fairly, and you will have time to think about what we were told and what is actually true. This is not surrender of our principles. This is surviving so that we can return home when this war ends." Sato looked around the camp, at the prisoners playing baseball in the distance, at the garden plots greening with spring vegetables, at the American guards chatting casually at their posts. Then Sato said, "But how do we live with the shame, Lieutenant? How do we return home after accepting their kindness?" Yamamoto had thought about this question for months. He had wrestled with it in the long hours of cotton picking during English lessons, in his bunk at night, and he had come to a conclusion that would have shocked the young officer he had been when he arrived. Then Yamamoto said, "Perhaps the shame is not in being captured. Perhaps the shame was in being lied to about who our enemy was, and in accepting those lies without question. What I have learned here is that human decency is not weakness. Treating prisoners well is not softness. It is strength of character and clarity of principle. We can learn from this, we can take this knowledge home and build something better." The months continued to pass. Summer heat returned, then fall coolness, then winter chill again. The war ground on, and the news became increasingly dire. Cities in Japan were being destroyed. The American advance across the Pacific was relentless. But inside Camp Como, life maintained its strange normality. Men worked, studied, played sports, tended gardens, and wrote letters home that might or might not arrive. In August of 1945, the news came that would change everything. Through their English lessons and the newspapers they were allowed to read, the prisoners learned of atomic weapons, of 2 cities destroyed in moments, of their emperor's surrender broadcast. The war was over. Japan had been defeated utterly and completely. The reaction among the prisoners was complex. Some wept openly, some retreated into themselves, some expressed relief that the dying would stop. Captain Henderson gathered them all in the mess hall and spoke through the interpreter. Then Henderson said, "Gentlemen, the war has ended. Your nation has surrendered and you will eventually be returned home. I know this news is difficult, that many of you are worried about what awaits you. All I can tell you is that the United States will work to ensure your safe repatriation. Until then, you remain under my care, and that care will not change. You will continue to be treated with the respect you have been shown since your arrival. That is my commitment to you. Repatriation did not happen immediately. It took months to organize the transportation of thousands of prisoners from camps across the United States back to Japan. During this time, Camp Como took on a strange quality, neither prison nor home, but something suspended between war and peace. Miss Eleanor continued her English lessons, even though the practical need for them had ended. Mitchell continued to employ prisoners on his farm, paying them their 80 cents per day even though the war was over. The local community continued their small acts of kindness, as if they understood that the transition back to peacetime would be difficult for men who had spent years in captivity, even comfortable captivity. In December of 1945, Yamamoto and the other Como prisoners were finally informed of their repatriation date. They would leave in January, travel to San Francisco, and board ships that would carry them across the Pacific to a homeland many of them barely recognized from the descriptions they received. On his last day at Camp Como, Yamamoto asked permission to speak with Captain Henderson privately. Permission was granted, and they met in Henderson's office, a simple room with a desk, filing cabinets, and a photograph of Henderson's wife on the wall. Through the interpreter, Yamamoto spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. Then Yamamoto said, "Captain, I want you to know that what you have done here, how you have treated us, it has changed me. When I arrived, I believed I knew what honor meant. I believed I understood strength and weakness, civilization and barbarism. But you have shown me that I was wrong about many things. You have shown me that true strength includes mercy, that real honor includes humility, and that the highest form of civilization is recognizing the humanity in your enemy. I cannot thank you for my capture, but I can thank you for teaching me these lessons. I will carry them home with me, and I will share them with anyone who will listen." Henderson listened to the translation, and his eyes were bright with emotion. Then Henderson said, "Lieutenant, I did nothing more than follow the rules my country set down and the principles I was raised with. But if our treatment here helped you in any way, then some good has come from this terrible war. My hope for you and for all the men here is that you'll return home and help build a Japan that can be at peace with the world, not through conquest, but through cooperation. That would be the best outcome of all." The interpreter translated, and the two men shook hands, former enemies bound by mutual respect and shared humanity. On a cold January morning in 1946, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto boarded a train in Como, Mississippi. No longer bound at the wrists, his uniform cleaned and mended. He carried with him a small box containing letters from Miss Eleanor, a handkerchief from the Christmas gift package, and a photograph that Mitchell had taken of the prisoners in his cotton field, squinting against the sun but smiling genuinely. As the train pulled away, Yamamoto looked back at the camp, at the white barracks and the oak trees and the baseball diamond. He thought about the men and women who had shown him that enemies could become teachers, that defeat could lead to growth, and that the greatest victories were sometimes not won on battlefields, but in the quiet, consistent choice to treat others with dignity. The journey home would take weeks. Japan would be devastated, struggling, occupied by the very forces that had run Camp Como. Yamamoto did not know what role he would play in his nation's recovery, but he knew the lessons he carried would shape it. He had learned that military might was meaningless without moral clarity, that industrial strength was empty without ethical foundation, and that the true measure of a civilization was not how it treated its friends, but how it treated its defeated enemies. Decades later, in the 1980s, an elderly Yamamoto would return to Mississippi as part of a reconciliation program. He would meet with surviving members of the Como community, including Mitchell's daughter and some of Miss Eleanor's former students. He would stand at the site of the old camp, long since demolished, and plant a cherry tree as a symbol of the peace that had grown from those unexpected seeds of kindness planted during wartime. He would give a speech to local students, speaking in heavily accented but clear English, and he would tell them that the greatest weapon America had deployed against him was not their bombs or bullets or overwhelming production capacity. It was their stubborn insistence on seeing him as a human being worthy of respect, even when he wore the uniform of their enemy. That weapon, he would say, was the one that truly defeated him, and in defeat, paradoxically set him free. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.